Hi, everybody. Welcome to week 3. And um, I'm hoping this week, during this overview lecture, not to take an hour like I did during week 2. Typically, my lectures will take about 30 minutes. So let me get right into this week's theme, which is trying to answer the question, what is policy analysis? So for this week, I have several readings assigned for you. I have Craft Chapter 4. I have the Bardak text, Part 1. And I have this book by Radin called Beyond Machiavelli. Now, I'm just having you read the first chapter. I might have you read the last chapter later on. It's a really interesting book. If you ever get a chance to read it, it kind of tells the story of how policy analysis developed in the United States through the eyes of some fictional characters that work starting in the 1960s for the federal government and other agencies. But she calls it Beyond Machiavelli for a good reason, and that is, if you remember the book The Prince by Machiavelli, beyond being about being really cynical about politics, it's about a person whose role in life is to be an advisor to literally a prince. And so this idea that there are policy advisors, scholars, and others who advise rulers, whether they be democratically elected rulers or monarchs of some type. This is a very old idea, but the thrust of the Radin text is that policy analysis really came into its own in the United States post World War II. You know, World War II, according to a scholar named Laswell in 1951, World War II was really a time where the social sciences actually became applied sciences and were applied to what Laswell says is the service of democracy in winning the war. So, for example, Laswell himself innovated the science of content analysis, which is a methodology that's still used in the social sciences today to look at text, whether that text be printed text in newspapers and magazines or the kinds of thinking of text as news, broadcast news reports. He used it really to analyze Nazi propaganda efforts, whether those were uh, printed form or speech form. Um, Economics theory was used extensively with strategic bombing, believe it or not. Um, the whole point of strategic bombing is kind of a violent means of economic destruction. It is intended to destroy uh, the economic productive capabilities and the command and control and leadership capabilities of an enemy state. Um, Operations research was used extensively in military planning, such as the Normandy invasion. And psychology was used extensively in the training of military forces. So Laswell talks about the social sciences going really from being pure science to applied science during World War II. But then more specifically, Radin talks about the growth of policy analysis as sort of this adjunct to typical agency line functions during the 1960s. This was as a result of Robert McNamara being Secretary of Defense in the Kennedy and Johnson administrations and bringing with him this idea of planning, programming, and budgeting, which he had applied at Ford Motor Company when he was in charge of Ford. But it's basically this idea that budgets should match with programs and plans of an organization. And so you may have seen this in another class being talked about as a budgeting tool. And indeed, it is a budgeting tool. But the point is that analysis, typically quantifiable analysis, was used to link uh, what the government did, in his case, the military, those that is programs, with the plans, that is what the government intended, and then circling back, matching that to the budget. And typically, these policy analysts that McNamara brought in, they were called kind of pejoratively, they were called whiz kids because they were not military people per se. They weren't connected with the business end of what the military did, but they were a separate function. And Radin talks about this having an analytic function that reported directly to the chief of the agency. And so policy analysis at this time is seen very much as a removed and neutral activity that tried to understand the politics in the agency and the politically inspired kinds of policies that were being put in place and trying to provide something like an outcomes analysis of what happens if you do this. Now we know that policy analysis can be both nonpartisan and partisan. So the RAND organization, which Radin talks about, um, really is still a very nonpartisan policy analytic organization. And you should go to the RAND organization, and what you will see in a lot of their policy analysis is some very really extensive econometric analysis in many cases, but it's typically nonpartisan. On the other hand, look at some of the policy analysis on typical issues and compare organizations like Heritage, which is we would call conservative, with the Center for American Progress, an organization we might call liberal. And so we see that policy analysis is both partisan and nonpartisan, but it grew from this idea that it was sort of uh, a very involved yet adjunct function to the actual act of policy making. And so, what is policy analysis? So, at this point, um, I want to say the rest of the lecture, I want to talk about the craft text, and I want to talk about, um, then I want to talk about the eightfold process, or the eightfold path presented by Bardak, and then I want to talk about our term paper, our policy analytic process for the class. So I'm going to try to connect those dots for you. So Kraft says that policy analysis can be, quite a few things, some very macro things or some very micro things. Remember last week we talked about this idea that there's a policy process, right? And so sometimes policy analysis is simply things like looking at the formulation of a particular policy or the implementation of a particular policy. You might even study the agenda setting of a particular policy. How did this get on the agenda? Um, Policy analysis can refer to studying substantive policy issues like ensuring health care to the entire population. We're arguing about this right now. Do we repeal the Affordable Care Act? And if we do, what replaces it? Because the policy goal, theoretically, is ensuring that the population has an opportunity, at least, to get healthcare insurance. And so that's a very substantive policy issue. Policy analysis almost always involves collecting and interpreting information and being able to clarify causes and effects. And policy analysis typically and often draws from numerous disciplines like economics, political science, maybe psychology. But I would add that it probably draws often from physical sciences like climatology and geology. How do you talk about climate change without referring to climatology? How do you refer to fracking if you want to analyze policy on fracking without referring to geology? How do you refer to infrastructure improvements without often referring to things like civil engineering when you're talking about the life of bridges, for example, or roads? And so, really, Kraft's bottom line is that policy analysis is part science and part political judgment. Well, I throw this chart in here because I want you to look at page 118 of your text. I'm not going to belabor this particular chart in the lecture, only to say I think Kraft does a really good job of pointing and of providing some illustrations on each of the 5 steps that he outlines as steps in the policy analysis process. We're going to go through those 5 steps, but this is a reminder to look at this because I think it will be very helpful to you. Okay, so what are these 5 steps? First of all, Kraft says you have to have a problem. You have to define your problem. So what does that mean? Why do we say problem? Well, a problem is an unsatisfactory condition requiring relief from either private means or from the government. So, that could be any number of things, right? So a problem could be as simple as your small city of 5,000 people has a problem because it needs water recreation in the summer, right? And so what's the solution to that? Well, before you get to the solution of that, you have to define the problem, right? You have to say, our city needs water recreation for children um, because the children are bored. And then you start talking about how do we describe this in ways that people understand? I mean, you might start out by saying, we used to have a swimming pool. The swimming pool is falling apart. We can't maintain it anymore, and it will cost us more to maintain it than to build something new. So who does that apply to? It applies to the children. And so why do we care that the children have something to do? Because we believe, for example, it might reduce vagrancy among children or vandalism. Um, and so we have to start coming up with indicators of what kinds of things would solve this unsatisfactory condition. And then we might want to, start talking about cause and effect even at this early stage in problem definition. So in your policy analysis process, you have to define the problem. You can't just say it would be nice to do this. You must say it's a problem, and here's why it's a problem, and here's potentially what we think are the causes of this problem. So the second step, according to Kraft, is constructing policy alternatives. Do you remember last week during the lecture, I referred to this one book? I just referred one slide from a book by Salomon. I'm going to get to that in the next slide. But Salomon talked about the tools of government. So, when we're talking about policy analysis, the second step isn't there's a problem and government has to fix it by, you know, implementing a program through this particular bureaucracy. There may be some other tool. It may be loans to people or loan guarantees. It may be vouchers. Um, so in the construction of policy alternatives, this is where you're starting to think about, okay, what are the tools? What are the ways the government could solve this problem? Step three, according to Kraft, is to choose the evaluative criteria. So how are you going to evaluate your alternatives? Now here, this is interesting because of course, um, what a lot of people might refer to, and Radin refers to this in one of her fictional characters, is cost-benefit analysis. That is a way of evaluating policy alternatives. It's certainly not the only way of evaluating policy alternatives. You might evaluate through things like technical feasibility. So, for example, it, your city may be trying to come up with a policy on social media. What is the social media policy for your city? Okay, you might say, well, we need to have, we need to build a bigger server or buy a bigger server to accommodate all of the social media that we put out. Okay, you're probably putting out tons of social media, right? But what's the technical feasibility of that? And part of that technical feasibility may be analyzing the manpower that you have on hand. You may be using some kind of risk analysis. Um, you know, if you say we want to change, we need a building code change um, whereby people don't smoke on their apartment decks. Well, there you could be doing a cost benefit analysis of that. You might be doing a risk analysis. If you've had one fire from smoking on a deck in the last 15 years, you should be doing a risk analysis that says, is this policy really worth the chase? There may be political factors. You might be talking about things like constitutional rights, personal freedoms, um, personal privacy, public safety. Um, you may be talking about things like damage to the environment. So there are evaluative criteria, and they don't always necessarily come down to cost and benefit. This chart goes back to that Salomon text, and this is talking about the tools of government, right? So the point of this chart, throwing this in here this week, as we did last week, is just to remind you that the answer to a policy question isn't always direct government um, action. It could be government sponsorship of something, but it's not always direct government action. So keep that in mind. Fourth, Kraft says you have to assess the alternatives, and this is where your criteria that you came up with is used to fairly assess alternative approaches. You know, you may have 3 or 4 different approaches. Um, so, for example, in your community of 5,000, you know, your alternatives for summer recreation might be build a small swimming pool, say a 25-meter in length swimming pool with a diving board or a diving pool. You may an alternative may be build an Olympic-sized pool, you know, 50 meters long with Olympic diving boards. It may be build a splash pad. It may be um, open up the fire hydrants once a week. So, however, whatever your alternatives are to your policy problem, what you have to make sure is whatever criteria you assign, that you evaluate each criteria fairly using the same measures. And then finally, number 5, draw conclusions. So, you know, this is where you are saying, okay, option 3 is the best one. Okay, so that is the Kraft approach. Um, and so then Kraft goes on to, and I'm going to kind of divert for a second. Kraft goes on to this idea that there are different ways of doing um, policy analysis. And he talks about scientific, professional, or political. I think this chart happens to be on page 129. Um, Again, I am not going to belabor this because as the weeks go on, we're going to talk about different types of policy analysis. But note, um, he talks about he divides up policy analysis into 3 broad categories. I think there are really more, but they divide it into 3, and I think this is important to keep in mind as you start looking at various policy analyses. You know, they talk about scientific policy analysis being something like an academic approach. So, for example, if you look at the policy journals, you would see scholars doing policy analysis that we would think of typically as being unbiased. They're providing analysis using some quantitative or qualitative tool, but it's typically also very theoretical and it might not help decision makers an awful lot. And then they talk about uh, professional policy analysis. Um, Here they start talking about think tanks. Now here we kind of start blurring the line, right? Some think tanks purport to be neutral. They may or may not be. And some think tanks say they're presenting neutral analysis and they may or may not be presenting it. So you have to be careful. And then they talk about typical political analysis. And often you will see this kind of thing, um, this kind of analysis from advocacy groups. So, for example, the Sierra Club is an advocacy group. The National Rifle Association is an advocacy group. The analysis that they present, you can expect to be slanted in the direction of their policy preferences. So the reason I throw this chart in here on 129 is because as the weeks proceed, we're going to be talking about these different kinds of analyses. We might not always describe them using simply these 3 categories, but it's important to keep in mind that policy analysis is, again, not a neutral, detached function. Okay, so the eightfold path. Um, this is from the Bardak text, and I have you read all of part 1. Um, So now let's think about what Kraft just said. Kraft said there's or 5 steps to developing a policy analysis. Bardak says it's a path, right? I mean, it's not steps in a policy analysis, it's a path. What does that say to you? Why would they use that word path? Because very much the way they describe it, it's a journey of understanding, policy and then analyzing it. But it's very similar to the 5 steps. So what are these 8 parts, these 8 stepping stones of the path, if you will? So first, like Kraft, they say define the problem. And all throughout their text, they give some little hints that are really helpful to you, and they're hints really in um, helping you think through the process. Not necessarily writing, but thinking through the process. So they tell you that in the problem, think in terms of, deficit and excess. So for example, um, the demand for water is growing in rural areas, but the aquifers are being depleted. So that's a supply and demand problem, right? They tell you to make the definition evaluative. We talked about that with Kraft, right? You have to start thinking about uh, how would you evaluate this. Um, so, I mean, you can't say something like people are unhappy and so we need a policy to fix that. Well, I mean, how do you operationalize happiness versus unhappiness? So you want to have something that you can evaluate. You want to be careful with what they call issue rhetoric, right? You want to avoid things like um, the public schools have failed because. Well, maybe you don't believe if you say the public schools have failed, for example, um, that's uh, that's rhetoric, and it's not going to help you make your case. Um, you need to understand that uncertainty exists in everything you study. There is going to be degrees of uncertainty um, as you define the problem. You need to be able to quantify. You need to be able to diagnose possible causal conditions, and you need to avoid pitfalls such as casual causality, as it's called. They don't even use this term. A former professor of mine used this term all the time. People use casual causality, and the example I would give, uh, you know, if there are X amount of homeless veterans in the homeless population, and people say, well, 20% of the population of homeless people is veterans because of PTSD. Well, maybe it's because of PTSD, but you really don't know that without further study. So the second step is assemble some evidence. This is a step that Kraft doesn't talk about a whole heck of a lot, and Bardak talks about a heck of a lot more. Um, and that is that you have to have evidence. Notice he doesn't use the term data. He's not talking about just simply raw data. He's talking about evidence. And the connection to sort of a court case is purposeful. The way we solve court cases is we present evidence, and the jury decides based on the preponderance of evidence, right? Um, so there's different kinds of evidence you can collect. Some is numeric data, but it might be also interviews or surveys that you can do. Think before you collect evidence. How is the kind of evidence that you're using going to be helpful or not? Is there literature available? The problem you want to address. If we want to talk about homelessness among veterans, I will tell you that there's literature available that are going to present different sides of that story. Then you want to construct alternatives. And what they advise is that, for example, start big and then go small. This is where you want to entertain ideas that are maybe a little off the wall or outside of the box. What if cost were no object? Where else has this problem occurred, and what's worked there? Um, so construct alternatives, and then select the criteria of evaluation. This sounds a lot like what Kraft was talking about. You have to have criteria. Um, Bardak goes into a little more detail about some other kinds of things you might be using to evaluate your policy. Not just efficiency. I mean, this might lead to something like cost benefit, but Bardak does caution that often, even in a cost benefit which looks neutral, it's not always neutral. The way you monetize costs and benefits might carry some intrinsic political values with it. You might want to compare things like equality, equity, fairness, and justice, freedom and community, political acceptability. Well, how do you compare all those things? The point is that it is possible to come up with metrics that can compare alternatives based on those kinds of concerns. Administrative feasibility, for example. Um, Here's an example of administrative feasibility. In a little town northwest of Omaha called Fremont, Nebraska, a few years ago, the city council uh, came up with an ordinance that said that everybody who moves into an apartment will be screened for citizenship. That this was their ordinance. And what they said was landlords could only rent to people who were either U.S. citizens or permanent residents. In other words, had the so-called green card. Well, so how did they administratively enforce that? What they said was the police department, um, each time a person moved into an apartment, the landlord would pay the police department some fee. I think it was $10 or $15, and the police department would do a background check. Okay. The counter argument to that was that the police department didn't have the administrative capability to be doing that. What the police department was getting paid to do was to fight crime, right? Either nonviolent or violent crime, to do traffic enforcement, to uh, investigate crimes that had occurred. Uh, and the argument was that administratively, the police department was not equipped for this. So administrative feasibility may be a factor in how you actually evaluate policy. The bottom line of this is that you design understandable metrics that support your criteria. So take a minute to look at table 1.1 on page 45. Okay, then Bartek says you should project the outcomes. Okay, and he really means this, project the outcomes. If we do this, what happens logically? So extend the logic of common sense. What happens if we do this policy? You could do this also by defining a base case. This is what the Congressional Budget Office does in terms of a base case. What the Congressional Budget Office does is when Congress proposes, a new tax structure and a new expenditure structure during the fiscal year, they extend that out using a base case. And they'll say, okay, under current law, the deficit in 10 years will be X based on all these laws and using some economic analysis. You might, for your city that is building a splash pad or a swimming pool, you could say, okay, here's our cost and benefit of this splash pad versus the swimming pool, but you might also want to extend out, your current rate of taxation. Here's what happens if our current taxation base stays the same and the rate stays the same. Here's what happens with our swimming pool cost and benefit. You might attempt to provide some magnitude projections. You know, for example, if we build the splash pad, youthful delinquency will decrease by X%. Now, how would you do that? That goes back to designing your metrics. You might use trends um, to see where your alternatives are going. So I use the term bend the curve there because that actually applies to the Affordable Care Act. When the Affordable Care Act was passed, nobody ever said it was going to lower healthcare premiums, and nobody ever said it was actually going to make healthcare less. What it really said it was going to do was it was going to decrease the increase of healthcare costs. So healthcare premiums were already going up. What uh, the Affordable Care Act purported to do was to, quote, bend that curve and decrease the increase in premiums, if you will. So projecting the outcomes. And then the final steps in this eightfold path are confront the trade-offs, stop, focus, narrow, deepen, and decide and tell your story. So what's really interesting here? Confront the trade-offs. This is where you're actually looking at the criteria that you set up and then saying, okay, look, every alternative of the five that I've presented might be a good alternative. So what am I really trading off? And the economic concept of opportunity cost comes in here. If I do X, what's the cost of not doing Y? Um, and then Bartek encourages you to stop, focus, narrow, deepen, and decide. Okay, so what he's really saying is go back to your alternatives and say, if this is such a great idea, how come nobody ever did it before? Um, and answer that. And then finally tell your story. So believe it or not, at this point is when we're actually starting to talk about writing a report. So the Eightfold Path is not about writing a report necessarily. It's about thinking through this policy process. And when you tell your story, notice some of the things Bardak suggests. This last one. Does your grandma get what you're saying? Well, maybe not. Um, but chances are you're going to have a better and easier time passing your policy if people can understand what it is your policy really is, particularly at the local and state level. Okay, so this all brings me to um, the course project. So here I am actually going to talk about chapters in a paper. But I hope that you can go back to Craft and to Bardak now and connect the dots and say, okay, this is why these chapters make sense. Okay, so your mission in this class is to provide me with two deliverables. What are these deliverables? First is a policy brief, and the second is what I call a roadshow presentation. So what's a policy brief? A policy brief is actually, that word is operative. I mean a brief policy analysis, something between 10 and 15 double-spaced pages. Um, the assumption is that you are working for a busy policymaker who thrives on understanding. Uh, and so you're writing something as a simulation for a policymaker so that that policymaker can use that to explain this policy to others. My one nod to academic requirements is I will insist that you use references cited in the text in kind of that APA style, and I want a reference list at the end. But this is not an APA style paper per se, with the exception of how I want you to list references. Okay, so what's the roadshow presentation? Again, this is a simulation. This is, in the simulation, something your policymaker can present at a moment's notice to other policymakers or to the Chamber of Commerce or to any other interested parties. And it should be about 12 to 20 minutes in length and include an audio narration. And so it should be able to fully explain the policy and your analysis. And so here's the chapters. So before we do anything else, let me just say the reason I break this down this way is actually to help you get this policy analysis done. Really, I mean, in a sense, it'd be easier for me just to tell you, go out and give me a term paper at the end of the term. Really, I want to do this in component parts so that we all kind of stay together, and that if there is difficulty, you and I can be interactive on this. So the very first thing I'm asking you for on January 28th is this exploratory memo. This doesn't ultimately become part of the analysis, but this is your proposal. This is where you're going to tell me the broad policy area that you're going to explore and what you're thinking of. A couple of you actually, I've already talked to you on the phone or by email, and you're starting to knock this out. So, but this is very interactive. Okay, this part of it is going to help you and help me basically lay the groundwork for what it is you're going to write on. So that's step one. That doesn't become part of the policy brief per se. The second the first chapter of your policy brief is an executive summary. Believe it or not, you're going to write that last. Don't start out your paper with an executive summary. I mean, don't make that the first thing you write. Your paper will start out with an executive summary, your policy brief, but you're going to actually wait to write that until the very end when it's done. The first thing you're going to give me, which is part 2 of the project, is the background and policy problem. So we talked about um, how do you define this policy problem? That's what you're going to do first. This is after we've decided on your project. So you're going to start out with the problem statement, and then part 3 is you're going to do the alternatives and criteria selection. And then finally, part 4, you will add in the outcomes comparison, the policy solution, um, and any references and appendices. And these are all part 4. And then finally, part 5 is this roadshow briefing, which becomes our quote in-class exercise where we share our policy analysis with our peers. So really, it's a very logical process, I think, of laying out a step-by-step way of writing this policy brief. And at the end, the idea is that you've actually constructed a usable policy brief that someone like a member of your state legislature or a member of your city council or your mayor or some other policymaker could actually put to good use uh, in examining this policy. And that's just the way I want you to approach it, that you work for this policymaker and you are providing them with the tools to be able to, quote, sell their policy to others. So that's it for this week. There's the references, all the references I used this week, which isn't very many. And as always, with any problems, I do stay in contact with me. A couple of you have contacted me, so please keep that up. I do appreciate being able to answer your questions. Thanks.